Hey everybody, welcome to Transport Treehouse, our little arboreal fortress where conversations about mobility and energy are casual and candid. My name is Russell Frost, but I'm merely the pilot for this vessel. Allow me to introduce you to the captain, Chelsea Sexton.
Why, thank you. That's such an
Ooh.
illustrious title. I can't imagine living up to that. But your prose is lovely. If anything, if we're honest, this is just an excuse for us all to hang out together with our friends and have the sort of conspiratorial hallway conversations we'd normally be having at conferences right now.
Right?
Yeah.
Like everybody using Zoom. So let me introduce our special guest. For this session in the Treehouse, we are very happy to have with us Kitty Adams. Kitty Adams is the executive director and founder of Adopt a Charger. Ms. Adams has facilitated the installation of hundreds of EV chargers in 10 states and has participated in a number of CEC and CARB workshops regarding alternative fuel vehicles and EV charging infrastructure. She was successfully awarded CEC grant funding to install EV charging at California state parks. Yes. And most recently, a GFO as part of a team to design a microgrid in a disadvantaged community. She has presented at the Electric Power at the Electric Power Research Institute Symposium, and has consulted on EV charging projects and policies nationwide. Does that sound familiar, Kitty? Yeah, I stole it right from your website, I admit it.
Yeah, that's me.
Welcome to the Treehouse, Kitty Adams.
Well, thank you for inviting me as a tree hugger. And there's no better place to be than in the treehouse. So,
right?
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Where you go to hang out with your friends. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, and I normally we wouldn't be that formal for long bios, but I wanted him to read all of that because you're one of my favorite people in the infrastructure side of the business, if not generally in life. But also, in my observation, because you are a fairly small organization, I feel like you don't get the credit you deserve, and you have done a lot of shit. So I wanted him to read all that so that people would get it. But I also know that, like many of us, you wear a couple hats. So rather than me not doing it justice, perhaps you could describe a little bit about Adopt a Charger.
Okay.
And some of the side stuff you also do.
Perfect. Adopt a Charger was started in 2011 by myself and two of my compadres from Plug in America, Paul Scott and Mark Geller. And basically the reason why we started Adopt a Charger is when the American Recovery and Reinvestment money was being handed out to EV charging infrastructure providers, I didn't see the business case for a middleman between the utility and the EV driver. And also what I saw was that the EV chargers were being crowded into commercial spaces. And it's awesome that there's an EV charger at the Walgreens by my house, but I'm never going to use it because it's a half mile from my house. You can only charge for 30 minutes in that spot. At that time, my car was, charging at 3.3. So you're lucky if you get 5 miles of range in that 30 minutes, and it's going to cost you $1.50. So it just didn't make sense. So I got together with Mark and Paul, and what we decided is let's go after the places where we as EV drivers want to charge our cars. For me, it was Leo Carrillo State Beach, 40 miles from my house. I couldn't make a round trip, zero emission trip without having a charger at the destination. I also wanted to have chargers at the museums. I love the Getty Center. I love LACMA, the Natural History Museum, and the National Park. So basically, it's kind of for selfish reasons I started it, because I wanted EV chargers at the places I like to go. And, these destinations are perfect because people are routinely driving 30 to 40 miles to get there. They stay there for 2 to 3 hours so they can add legitimate amounts of range, to their vehicle. And for me too, it also goes beyond just charging cars. And I wanted to educate the public about electric transportation. It's really hard when that car is driving down the road for people to really make the connection, but the aha moment happens when they go to, at the Crissy Field in San Francisco, and they see a car plugged in. And then more importantly, the EV curious gets to engage in conversation with actual owners who are the best salespeople for the new technology. I'm sure you guys know that there still is a little bit of a disconnect at the dealer level when it comes to selling electric vehicles.
Yes, a
So
little bit.
yeah, so when I get those people to talk, I'm winning. I literally, when we were at the Muir Woods ribbon cutting, some people got off a bus from Kansas and asked to take my picture because they had never seen an electric car before. So,
Wow.
yeah, a lot of it is just really about the awareness,
For
outreach,
sure.
and education. So,
Yeah, I mean, well, some of us longer than others, but for a long time, we've been talking about how the vast majority of charging happens at home anyway.
yes.
But regardless of speed, regardless of place, there's still a certain amount of public charging that is useful, yes, to help the EV drivers, but most of them aren't dependent on it, more to raise awareness, because
Yeah.
new folks aren't looking for what a charger looks like. They're looking for what a gas station looks like. And there's not really
Yeah.
uniform design around chargers. And so there needs to be increased visibility and more uniform signage and all of those things. But the more they see chargers out in the wild, even if we know they won't be dependent on them as much, most people, it gives them comfort. And they think, well, maybe an EV would work for me just by seeing them out in the world and being used and charged.
Yeah.
But you also, especially back then, you focused on a lot of the places that the major networks weren't so interested in, because the commercial opportunity wasn't the same as a shopping mall or another retail site or something like that. So there's also long been a disconnect between serving the drivers and serving the business case of whatever individual company is involved.
That's true. And you make a good point, because a lot of the EV chargers that I install, like at state parks and national parks, are in really remote locations, and they're useful in their remoteness. You know, they're not going to be utilized as much as a charger maybe in a major metropolitan area like Los Angeles, but still we need them. We need them to enable, you know, EV tourism and encourage people to leave their gas car at home, I guess.
Right.
So yeah.
So your model is different, closer to, I mean, the analogy you used to use with me was adopt a freeway, adopt a highway. So somebody sponsors the maintenance of that highway for a certain stretch. And so in your case, companies sponsor the placement and the energy and what's required for some of these chargers to land at the more desirable locations for drivers, but less commercialized for others.
Yeah, these places are difficult to commercialize. I mean, some locations are not even open 7 days a week. A lot of the parks are really seasonal. So if that site host had to pay the networking fees, they would be losing money. And if they tried to pass it on to the EV driver and the cost per kilowatt hour,
never get used.
Yeah, it never gets used. It's more expensive than gas. It's actually a detriment. You know, back to like the people that don't drive electric cars, they need to see the EV chargers to realize that EVs are ready for prime time. And one of my biggest pet peeves is when EV chargers are broken, or if they're too expensive and they're not getting used. You know, then it just kind of builds animosity, because people feel like these good prime parking spots are just sitting empty. And for the site host, I mean, it's more about parking than it actually is charging cars, because that parking space has a value. I mean, when I started doing this back in 2012, I think Palo Alto would value an EV charge, a parking space at $45,000 per year. And I've heard it's gone up since that. So if that spot is sitting empty, if they're losing out on parking revenue, if those businesses see empty spots in front of their shop, it can be really, really aggravating. So there's a lot of different approaches to EV charging, but I think everybody's really got to be sensitive to, you know, especially with level 2 charging, what I deal with, you're fitting into an existing footprint, an existing parking lot. So it's got to make sense for the EV drivers and people that don't drive electric cars. So.
Right. Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of the other networks would say the same thing of like, that's part of why our fees are so high, because, you know, we have to pay for parking at least those spots, or whatever the financial arrangement is with the actual property owner. But at the end of the day, I mean, one of the things that you and I gripe about together a lot is that if whatever someone's doing, there's lots of models, but if the charging doesn't serve the driver in the end, it's not going to get used, and that doesn't make anybody happy. So it doesn't matter if you're trying to charge the driver or you're trying to sell subscriptions to an automaker who will give away 2 years of free charging with the sale of a car or whatever. At the end of the day, the constituent is always the user, whether it's an individual private owner or a fleet driver or whoever. So if it doesn't serve them, none of the entities are going to be happy.
Well, you know what? Russell and I were talking about how everybody wants the data.
Yeah.
But what I hope is that these EVSPs and the automaker OEMs are on Facebook monitoring these driver
They're
groups,
not.
because you can learn a whole lot about the experience. I mean, no offense to the Bolt, but in the beginning there was a lot of stories on Facebook about Bolt drivers that were trying to take these long road trips across California.
Yep.
And it was pretty sad to read. You know,
Yep.
even now we're still building it out in a state like California that's leads the nation in the sale of electric cars. We still are plugging a lot of holes in the EV roadmap, you know.
For sure.
If you want to go to Yosemite right now, there's only one car you can do it in, a Tesla, you know. So we definitely need it. And this is another thing Russell and I were talking about prior to you jumping on, Chelsea, was the appropriate level of charging for the use case.
Yeah.
Because, you know, that's the other thing is, especially when there's grant money involved, you don't know if they're just putting in that charger to cash the check or if they're really looking at a long-term business strategy out of that location. So
right.
I like to think about EV charging as an ecosystem, and there's a place for every level of charging in that ecosystem. Recently at the California Energy Commission, some data was shared that 53% of the charging still happens at level 1. Level 1 is just your basic 120 volt outlet. Everyone's got one. So there's no reason why people can't, right? So that makes perfect sense for long dwell time, like airports or overnight parking. You know, for me,
and even some workplace. If you're there 8 hours, that's about, you know, level 1 is like 4-ish miles per charging hour in your average EV. If you're there all day anyway, and the average driver drives like 35 miles a day, if for those that are still commuting in these times, even a workplace can use level 1.
Right. So, I mean, for me, I want to make sure that any kind of public funding is spread evenly through all the different resources that are out there, because it's gotten to be so prescriptive that you need cord connected level 2 that's Energy Star certified and has future bi-directional grid capability and a credit card swiper. What happens is it's getting way too expensive per charger, and also we're crushing the innovation. So, but back to the ecosystem. So we have the level 1 charging, which is long dwell time, overnight kind of appropriate use. Then we have destination charging, which is what I deal with, and workplace, where level 2 charging is perfectly appropriate.
Yeah, 240 volts.
Yeah.
Usually somewhere between 20 and 40 miles per charging hour.
Yeah, so it's plenty. It's plenty for me. I mean, hardly ever do I actually need DC fast charging, but I'm glad it's there. So where I see DC fast charging is, you know, by the freeway exit, maybe in popular metropolitan areas that are serving the Uber and Lyft drivers, and people need to add a lot of range in just a little amount of time. So there's definitely a spot for each and every one of these.
Right.
And I think when it comes to the business case, the reason why, you know, again, I started Adopt a Charger as a nonprofit is because I did not want to have to answer to a board of, you know, investors, or try to make sense out of how do you make markup on that small cost per kilowatt. So I just wanted to truly look at it through the lens of an EV driver. Like, where do I want these EV charging stations? And getting the corporate sponsorship, it's not easy. It doesn't cover the whole cost. I usually have to couple it with a grant, but it's an opportunity for these, you know, automakers or any organization that wants to have like a green halo to support green transportation and electrified future. I think right now is a time more than ever where people are really focused on corporate social responsibility.
For
So
sure.
so this is an opportunity for them to, walk the talk and put their advertising and philanthropy money towards something that's really going to benefit,
Right.
the
Yeah,
EV.
because at the end of the day, who wouldn't like their name on a charger in Yosemite saying brought to you by
Yeah.
this company? For
And you
sure.
know what? We talk about this company, but I really want to bring up that a few of my EV charging installs have been just past the hat to honor
Yeah,
people that have
I
passed
was thinking
away.
of that too, the
Yeah.
memorial chargers and things.
Yeah.
Well, and that's so much of this movement has always been driver led, driver supported, to
Mhm.
some degree driver funded, where someone wants a charger. I mean, you, I think, do the bulk of it, but I know of chargers in Florida and various other places
Yeah.
where just like some random EV driver decided he wanted a charger there, or the local club, and they got together and figured out the funding to do basic chargers, Clipper Creek style chargers in
Yeah.
those areas, especially 10 years ago in the really early adopters. And that's kind of how they had to get it done. It's a scrappy bunch we are.
Well, and it's still kind of the case outside of California. I always say adopted chargers, not me, it's we. And the best success example I can give is Evolve Kentucky.
Yep.
They're on 27 installs between Kentucky and Indiana. And actually, they're probably putting another one in right now as we speak, because they're just super motivated EV drivers that approach businesses and municipal locations like libraries. And I donate some charging equipment to them. They get a little bit of money to fund the install. Boom, a week later, we have an EV charger there. So especially in places like Kentucky, Arkansas,
Yes.
Indiana, they need the help because they don't have the utilities are just starting to dip their toe into the EV charging world, and some states you can't even buy a Tesla. A lot of states in Kentucky you can't even see a Nissan Leaf at the dealership. So it is up to the drivers. If we want to have a 50-state strategy starting
Right.
in 2020, we need to really engage with the EV driving community to get the word out there and expand charging infrastructure too.
Did you want to get a word in edgewise, Russell, or shall I just keep?
I'm content to sit and learn. No, I mean, there's so many things that you guys have already talked about that make so much sense. I mean, part of
Clear
this
that
is,
you've been left out.
no, thank you, Chelsea. But no, you know me. If I got something, yeah. But no, there's a lot of really good points. I mean, there's the whole chicken and the egg thing. Is it charging that's gonna drive EV adoption, or is it EV adoption that's gonna drive charging? And we know it's both, because nobody wants to buy an EV if they've never seen a charger in the wild.
Yeah.
Right? And no place does it stand out better than at parks and at these destinations that you guys are working on, which is why that's so important, because that person's going to go into the dealership and the dealer's going to go, you don't want an electric car, there's no place to charge it. And somebody's going to go, wait, we saw one at Yosemite, jerk, or whatever.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? We saw one
Yeah.
in Muir Woods. We know that they're out there. So
Yeah,
there's certainly one
exactly.
in the town where we live. I mean, that's huge. And the other thing is the difficult part is locations change. Locations get stale, just like retail. Demographics change, neighborhoods change, and sometimes a charger that was in a great place in 2015 may not be in as great a place in 2020.
Right.
Okay, I
In
don't know.
Some
urban
of them.
locations, I think that's probably more applicable than like Kettleman City, for instance. You know what I mean? Like those big off the highway, off the super highway things are always going to be relevant, but
Yeah.
it may change in more urban locations. But yeah, you guys are,
Well,
please.
if I could speak to that, if I'm working with anybody in LA, they're not putting in less than 20 EV chargers. It's gotten to the point where, like with the Getty Center, I started in 2013 with 24 chargers. The next year we increased to 40.
Wow.
This year we're installing 108 EV chargers for the public, 32 EV chargers for employees, a DC fast charger to serve their electric shuttle bus. They have an all-electric security fleet. It's, I used to say, oh, it's like the Johnny Appleseed approach. I'll put a few chargers in and things will sprout up around it. And that does happen, especially like with the national parks and state parks. As soon as we put those chargers in, the gateway community, those businesses, the B&Bs and those kind of things start to put in EV charging.
Yeah.
Which is great. But if you're in a city you got to go big. You know, Los Angeles has really big electrification plans. I think Mayor Garcetti wants 50% of the parking spots to be electrified by the time the Olympics
Wow.
come. So the cars are out there.
Yeah, yes, in some places, I mean, obviously it's a very different picture. And so, you know, we're all sitting in California, but I'm mindful of
Yeah,
the fact that not everybody is. And
that's
I
true.
mean, I love that, yes, largely state parks and all that, but generally speaking, your constituency has largely been underserved areas,
Yeah,
however you define that. So Kentucky and Arkansas and those areas are relatively underserved, and I would say
mhm,
completely underserved in terms of from an industry perspective, and yet have an outcropping of enthusiasts that are willing to help start things anyway.
yeah,
And so you also do sort of independent consulting and things like that. So the adopt a charger model works very well for some sites. And there are other sites where people just need guidance in some ways. They don't know where to go.
yeah,
Regulations vary. Not every, you know, California has low carbon fuel standards and other things that intervene economically in various ways. But
yeah.
lots of places are just getting started, policy and otherwise. So I want to, well, I don't want to beg you for free consulting, but I want to solicit a few opinions for different groups.
Ooh.
Sure.
So going back to the regulatory aspect, you know, we talked a little bit about sort of what's happening in California and sort of the PUC level of requiring more data and more networking and Energy Star and all the things. And there's some, I mean, on paper, the nerd in me goes, yes, bring me all the data. But from a practical standpoint and what helps serve sites and drivers, that all adds cost.
Yes.
So as other areas are looking at crafting their own regulations and, you know, just basically as everyone's starting to pay attention and learn from what's been done before, what is your opinion of the balance of adding these things for consumer protection and driver experience and learning from early deployment, all of which is fair,
Yes.
versus adding cost or only serving for-profits versus utilities and all, you know, how, if regulators were listening, what would you like them to hear?
Oh, that is a big question. Well, one thing, like starting right off, I would say that level 2 charging and DC fast charging are totally different. You know, a DC fast charger, you're adding significant range and you're there 15, 20 minutes. So that's more like a depot model, more like a gas tank. So there you definitely want people to know how much they're getting, what the cost per kilowatt hour is. You know, you want all that transparency.
Right.
Level 2 charging, in my experience, it's more like a drinking fountain than it is a vending machine. So there, you know, it's, especially when I look at state parks and national parks, they've been in the business of providing electricity as an amenity for a long time because
Right.
they provide a 240 volt, you know, NEMA 1450 plug for your RV. And they literally asked me, why is this any different? So, you know, it's not different. For them, it's definitely more about that parking spot, that campsite, than it is about, you know, the 50 cents of electricity that they're providing
Right.
to the person that's parked there. So, you know, kind of considering those separately instead of having blanket policy to cover both of those, because I agree with you, it's gotten a little bit crazy here in California. Certain things, you know, you just have to suck it up, like ADA compliance. The
Of
reality is,
course.
yeah, you know, we have an aging population. We need to accommodate that. It adds to the cost of a project, but rightly so. And then there's these other layers of expense, you know, the
Right.
credit card swiper, the need for a credit card swiper, the need to comply with standard weights and measures, which, you know, that it's cheaper to just give it away for free than it
Right.
is to try to build in all the complexity and software and everything you need to make those certain things happen. So for me, like what I encourage is flexibility in funding. For public funding, we don't know. There's a lot of things that we don't know, and let's try them. Let's try um, cordless charging. Let's try wireless charging. There's so much innovation that can happen, but it can't happen if, you know, the funding is got to be XYZ. You
Right.
know, so
But it also seems like, yes, let's try some things, but there's also some things we know.
yeah,
And one of the things we know, for example, is that the average shelf life of a level 2 charger in the wild is maybe 4 years, give or take, according to the charging companies that tell me. So you might have different data.
I have
But
different
yeah,
experience because I use different, I'm using,
yes. Well, yes, it can be supplier dependent, but
yeah,
whether it's 4 or 3 or 5 or 6 or whatever, my point is
yes.
mainly that to some degree, I see lots of regulation trying to future-proof for 20 years when it's super unlikely this hardware is going to be the same hardware in 10, if not sooner. And so it's easy, that we always talk about the biggest part of the cost is the wiring, the installation, and all of that. And so from a pragmatic perspective, it seems to me in lots of places where there are unknowns, especially where there are unknowns, you start with something cheaper, cheerful, less networked, less fancy, less expensive, see how it goes. And it doesn't preclude the option of getting fancier later with a different set of hardware that is networked and all of those things.
It's true. And I do, I brought up the example of the Getty. When you get to be that big, you can't just put in, a bunch of dumb chargers because you'll have,
Right.
spikes in demand. So there, I'm adding some adaptive charging software so that we can spread out the EV charging, especially for employees throughout the day. And everybody gets what they need, but that way we're not getting a spike when everybody gets in at 8 a.m. and plugs in their car. So there is a role for some of that.
For sure.
But I've got to say, like with the California State Parks, when you're up in Mendocino and there's not a lot of charging around, the most important thing is that you're going to be able to plug in and add range to your car. So, and the smaller installs, 1 and 2 chargers, they're not going to really factor into a bidirectional grid like a workplace with 100 EV chargers,
Yeah.
So again, it's like the appropriate
right thing for the job, right tool for the job.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I'm always on the balance of some flexibility, appropriate flexibility for anything publicly funded, which I define as, grant funding, like CEC taxpayer type funding, but also ratepayer for utilities and quote settlement funding in the case of EVgo years ago or Electrify America now, that there should be some oversight that hasn't really happened. Electrify America has a fair amount of oversight, but most of the other examples have less from a driver experience perspective. And so on one hand, I'm like, yes, more flexible and try the things, but also someone, adult supervision to ensure reliability and appropriate pricing that's not completely gouging and, uptime and all of, and yes, tracking some utilization so we can kind of make sure that the public funding is going to chargers in the right spot. And if it's not being used, let's know why. Some of those sorts of things as well. I want to make a driver's bill of rights is a term that's been used before, but I want to create like the 10 commandments of public funding.
You go, girl.
For EV charging and probably other EV stuff. All incentives should have strings attached. But yes, I feel like there's that gaping hole that hasn't yet been established by any oversight agency, let alone the ones that are more newly thinking about it than we are. So if we haven't gotten our act together, everybody else learn from our both successes and skin knees.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that what's happening in California in 5 years will be probably nationwide policy. So like, let's get it right here in California, and let's look at how the money has been spent up until now. That's the other thing. Like, let's not double down on things that are not.
For sure. Let's not waste more.
Right, for sure. And it's interesting. I like to look at, read final reports from CEC spending. I like to look at, the NREL reports, EPRI reports, all these different, there's a lot of information out there. One that I was talking to Russell about before we started filming was a Luskin study that was done, I think in 2012 or 2013, where they said that the maximum EV drivers will pay for charging away from home for level 2 charging is 29 cents per kilowatt hour. And then I'm reading, some information where I think the average cost for level 2 charging is 37 cents per kilowatt hour. Okay,
in California.
In California, yeah. It's difficult to do the conversion from kilowatt hours to price per gallon of gas. So I kind of have it in my head that 34 cents equals about $5.50 a gallon of gas. But, but what people do know is how much they're paying for their electricity at home. So that's what they're comparing it at. And when it's 3 to 10 times more expensive out in the public,
Right.
the chargers are not going to get used. And then, that sets
Yeah.
up a
I
whole,
mean, on one hand, I'm of the mind that we should be encouraging people who can charge at home to mainly charge at home
yeah,
and lower and slower. Like, I feel like we've gotten a little too extreme on the faster is always better kind of
yes, you're
mindset,
right.
and that we're recreating gas stations. So I'm firmly in the camp of, to some degree, speed should command a premium. I'm also really concerned at the degree to which we're saying, let's force, EA and EVgo and all the others to do lots of DC charging in disadvantaged communities, economically or environmentally. Access, yes, all day long, but if all we're doing is installing really fast charging that people aren't going to be able to afford to use, it's still the same problem. So it doesn't really matter why. At the end
Right.
of the day, it has to serve the drivers in every area and for every use case. And we're just getting started on all of those, because we've largely been focused on the private early adopting drivers that buy their Leaf or their Volt or their Tesla or their whatever and go forth. And we're just kind of dancing into like the Uber and Lyft drivers and going from there. But
Yeah.
it feels to me it's too many times like we're shoving one solution into all of
Yes.
the problems. Yes, multifamily dwelling is hard. The answer is not always a 150 kilowatt charger in the center of town that no one can use, because it's, $30 to get 100 miles.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that because in the area I live in, they did a pilot where they put DC fast chargers in parks near MUD to
Yeah.
try to, yeah, and that wasn't as successful, I think, as they thought. And I think part of it is it's just too expensive.
Yeah.
People like the convenience. One thing too, that back to electricity as an amenity, what has been really successful in metropolitan areas for level 2 charging is when malls and different commercial properties install EV charging to attract EV
Yes.
drivers. I know I go to the mall by my house for dinner all the time because they have a big bank of free level 2 charging. So I
Yep.
park my car to get, the couple dollars worth of electricity, and I go in and my family has dinner and we spend hundreds of dollars in the mall.
Right.
So there's
And this
other
is the
ways.
original model. Like back in the EV1 days, GM funded half of the public charging, and we all had contractors' licenses to install the stuff. But it was free, and we were playing with like credit card swipers and even 25 kilowatt higher speed stuff at the time. But all of the site hosts, whether all the malls, all the Marriotts, all the Ralph's Markets, all those guys said, you know what? We would rather consider it a marketing expense, give away 25 cents of electricity versus all of the added costs to try to monetize that, and just sort of consider it promo marketing. And the drivers, of course, we're all EV drivers. We know that they want to generally support those that support them. And so, yes, it was very much returned in kind. We're still in the early adopter stage of things and will be for some time. We're trying to get to early majority. But that remains true, that everyone's sort of co-creating the success of this together. And so we have far more affinity for anybody that wants to help with charging or otherwise versus like the average Chevron station down the street. It's not reached that level of commoditization yet.
It's on its way, definitely with
And yes,
Shell.
yay when it gets here. That's what we
Yeah,
want.
right.
But I have a couple more questions before we let you reluctantly go, although you shall be back. So going
Like a
back to the
threat,
cost
Chelsea.
thing,
Yeah.
What's happening?
threat, promise, whatever.
Just
Things
saying.
happen. So on the fee side, a topic that I tend to spend a fair amount of energy on is that of networking fees and the role they play in affordability of charging. So on one hand, yes, there are places in which networking is useful and required. As somebody who also travels elsewhere in the world, and in particular Europe, is ahead of us on most of these fronts,
Yes.
it has seemed to me for some time that our general networking fees are abusive compared to what they need to be. And that's factoring into affordability as well.
Yes, it definitely. I do go to Europe a lot. My husband's Dutch, so we spend a lot of time in Amsterdam where it just seems to work. There's Tesla taxis everywhere. And in Europe, the average monthly cost per charge port for networking is $8 to $10. And in the US, I think it's like $32 to $35 per charge port. So it's 3 times more expensive just to be connected to the network.
Yep.
It's not even talking about the electricity or running the credit card or maintenance, it's so yeah, that definitely triples the cost per kilowatt hour.
Right.
And
Especially on level 2. I mean, I won't ask you to name names, but you
Okay.
have told me of installations you have.
Names.
Well, I will leave the details up to you. But you cite cases, at least in hallway conversations, where
Yeah.
these sites are spending more just on the networking fees than any of the electricity that ever gets used, regardless of whether they're monetizing it or not. It just is a complete loss leader on the networking fee alone before you get to credit cards and everything else.
Well, those people are starting to wise up. So they called me back. In my own experience, the one example that I give people is Will Rogers State Historic Park, where the total cost of electricity for, I think it was 3 years, was this is off the top of my head, was $1,200. The networking fees for those chargers would have been $3,600. So it's three times more for the networking than it is to actually provide the electricity as a sponsored amenity. And so if you add the electricity and the networking fees to get that $4,800 to try to recoup the cost, I would have had to charge 54 cents per kilowatt hour.
Ugh.
Right. So people wouldn't use it, and then it would be even worse because I'd still have to pay that networking without the opportunity to recoup. And I think the one that Chelsea's probably remembering is I told her
That was
about.
one. I'm also remembering a university.
Yes. And this is a good example. Cal State Long Beach was one of my first installs, and it was to honor Doug Kortoff.
Yep.
He was in the movie Who Killed the Electric Car. He was a very vocal.
He was a passionate man.
Yeah, so he was a big player. You know, he was an early advocate for electric transportation, and he unfortunately passed away. But before he did, I was able to ask, would you like an adopted charger? And Long Beach was his alma mater. So we approached them. They were like, yes, we like the idea of EV charging. So we installed 4 EV chargers. They were offered fee-free. You know, people just had to pay for their parking spot. And then it got really big really fast. So they came to me and said, what do we do? How do we expand? So I encouraged them to take advantage of the Southern California Edison Charge Ready program, which pays the bulk of the expense. It pays to bring the power to the curb, you know, the transformer upgrades, conduit wiring, all of that. So all the school needed to pay for was the equipment, the EV charger itself, and the networking fees. Well, for those 44 EV chargers, they were losing $34,000 a year. A public institution that is having difficulty getting by, that's a big expense. You know, some things are going to kind of change about that because I've been talking to them about, you know, the low carbon fuel standard, you know,
Right.
Those credits have a value, and about other options, you know, now that their 3-year term is about to come due, you know, what else can we do? So, yeah, I think we've learned a lot from that.
Yeah. So lastly, similar to the regulator one, I have 2 other constituents I'd like you to give some advice to.
Okay.
Especially outside of California, recognizing that others are earlier in the journey, and the advantage being they might have more flexibility in the crafting. For any utilities listening that are thinking about doing programs, besides the standard, I know that every charging service in the world loves the make ready, like you do all the wiring and we'll come in and put a box on top and then monetize it. So that's the standard model, and sometimes some charger rebate kind of things. Is there any other advice you would give them in terms of ways that they could be helpful as an entity?
Well, I think it's really just helping themselves in a weird way, because where like level 2 charging really can play a role is in grid management.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like in California, we have overgeneration of renewables. It's expensive to curtailing. You know, like we're paying Arizona to take our excess power. So being able to use that as a tool for the grid and getting people to plug in at the appropriate times between 2 and 5 p.m. and midnight to 6 a.m., they can save all ratepayers money by using EVs as a tool to do that.
Yeah.
And then also too, it's like, you know, we just had a big meeting here in California about how do we attract more private investment to,
Right.
you know, because the public funding can only go so far. How do we, you know,
Yes.
get it the rest of the way? So I would say that with the utilities, we can unlock some capital there to help make, these projects happen. And they're already bringing the power to the curb. Why,
Right.
why can't they go ahead and own and operate the EV charger itself,
I agree. Well, and I think some of them want to, and so that's part of the regulator utility conversation. And let's face it, some of the network competitors would prefer to keep utilities and others out of certain aspects of it. But
they've been vocal about that, yes.
I know, yeah, the docket letters are out there. So
yes.
ChargePoint, EVgo, all those guys would prefer that utilities kind of just stay back and pay for the expensive part and leave them to it.
Mm-hmm.
But from a driver perspective, and frankly, from a realistic perspective, coming through, not even out of all things COVID and all, no one is coming out of this with more money. Everybody is coming out of this with a smaller budget, and we're still trying to get all the same things done with less money. And even as we should have been more flexible with respect to involvement of some entities before, we have to now, especially in up and coming areas that just are not getting all of the attention that the Californias of the world are getting.
Right, you're right.
And you don't have the luxury of being so picky in some ways.
And back to your concept of the EV driver bill of rights. Every EV driver already has a relationship with their utility. And it's pretty much, if there's a brownout or a blackout, your utility is going to come and fix it. So that's another problem with, having this middleman layer between the EV driver and the utility is, beyond the accessibility and affordability, it's the reliability that's often in question.
Yeah.
Especially with a model where people sell the hardware and then they license the software. If that charger breaks, it's like, well, it's not my fault. It's the site host. That's their responsibility to pay the $2,400 to fix that charger. So with the utilities,
or lots of small businesses, small EV companies, charging companies that go out of business.
Oh, those two. Yes.
You've been to San Diego.
Who, me?
Right. Right. The utility is not going to go out of business. And people say that, well, the utilities are monopoly. Yeah, they are. And that's, they're the sole player in that territory. And, how does that's how we're going to keep the cost of EV charging as close to the cost per kilowatt hour, is by letting the person that actually sells the electricity in that territory provide it as transport fuel. And it's funny when early on in the early days, talking to the different utility people, they would say, oh, it's like we're just looking at the load. It's like if somebody adds another refrigerator or somebody's building a hot tub, so for them, they are selling the electricity for the refrigerator. They are selling the electricity for the hot tub. Why can't they be selling it for the car? They do at home.
At least appropriately. I mean, no differently. As I said, all public funding, and I consider them to be part of it, should have oversight. So, I mean, I know that some folks watching would go, oh my God, these people hate all the networks and they think they should all be free and charitable. And that's not the case. I mean, we have to get to a business case for charging, no different than gasoline or any other kind of fuel. However, we also have to survive to get to that point. And so there's a balance of, of course, any of the big companies we're thinking of should be able to make a business out of their product, but in a way that is also responsible to the public funding they're asking for and the public support they're asking for, and that serves the drivers. Or else, if they're providing a fantastic service, people will pay for it. But the thing that I keep noting to every one of them when they kind of bitch at me is, I never ever see drivers standing up next to you in any of these public meetings or joining any, whether not everyone wants to write a public letter to the PUC, like whatever, I guess that's a little bit wonky,
actually.
But some do, and even more show up to CARB meetings. And Tesla drivers come out in droves to regulatory meetings to help support the companies because of the whole co-creation aspect. So if any of the big networks were providing really great service for drivers, we would know about it. And yet that is never what I hear in the public forums. And so I always sort of encourage them to go back and refocus that way.
And what's the value added here? How do we best serve the end consumer? Because I feel like a lot of time the EVSPs are confused and they think the customer is the automaker or the utility, when it's actually the EV driver. And I just want to make a point, because you're talking a lot about how do we create this business case. Is that the priority here? I mean, when we're
Not
trying to address
necessarily.
climate change, we need to sell cars. Governor Brown made the mandate, or I guess it's a mandate, that he wants 5 million cars on the road by 2030 in California. We are not even close to that. We're not close to making our 2025 goals either. So when it comes to selling the cars, guess what? Free charging sells cars. And I think about, the three things, the three priorities of CARB are to increase electric vehicle miles traveled, raise awareness of the new technology, and to reduce carbon emission and GHG. Nowhere are they saying create a business case for reselling electricity. That's not the priority. So I think we got to get, again, refocus on what are we trying to do here. And I can tell you, just by like back to the Getty example, when I first started working with them, 3 employees drove electric cars. A year later, 36 employees drive electric cars. Now we're over 80 employees driving electric vehicles just because the workplace charging is there. So let's use the EV charging to help sell the cars. Doesn't that just make sense?
And profit is not the primary goal, but my point is more that I respect that is the mission of some companies, and they absolutely have the right to do that. But the funny thing I always hear is like, well, but so-and-so, whatever company, is trying to do the right thing, and therefore you should support them. It's like, let 1,000 flowers bloom kind of stuff. And I get it. They are absolutely entitled to pursue whatever business case they want. They are not inherently entitled to my support of it if they're not helping overall deployment and the cause and drivers and all of those things. So yeah, go forth and do it, but don't expect me to shill for you. It's sort of the balance we end up on. So aside from hiring you, and I know your rates, I will just say you're kind of, well, I don't want to say cheap because that just sounds wrong. You are great value for money.
Very wrong.
So I encourage anyone listening to reach out on that front. But especially outside of California, where someone is just sort of starting as a workplace or a company or whatever, that like they're thinking about maybe putting in some charging non-residential, and everyone ends up sort of getting on Google, and there are lots of companies that would give them individual sales pitch, but most of those are trying to sell one thing. So if someone's looking for agnostic advice, or just, where should they start looking? Like I said, they should call you, but otherwise, where should they start some research, and what should their thinking be around what they actually need versus what they might think they need?
Well, I'm going to think about 2 different types of consulting that I do. And one is working with utilities. And there, I actually had somebody ask me from the Gulf Coast states, how do we, we want to encourage people to plug in at the right times. How do we do that? It's very simple, rate design. It doesn't have to be something sophisticated at the EV charger that's sending a text message to the driver so that they can, leave their desk and go move their car. What it can be is simply in rate design. If you can charge for next to nothing from midnight to 6 a.m., that's when you're going to do it. And then for the site host, there's a lot of different ways to cook the egg, I guess. And it just really depends on what their goals are for the program and how many EV charging. So workplace is going to be a little bit different than a commercial area where, you're having a lot of different random people using their chargers. You've got multiple different users every day instead of one person parked there all day. So I would say reach out, because I could probably save you a lot of money. And the other thing is I'm agnostic in all of this. I've installed a bunch of different kinds of EV chargers, and I've referred people to all of those EVSPs that you mentioned, ChargePoint,
we all do.
Electrify America, because there is a role for that. But it's just not something that's a blanket statement. And sometimes I think that there's a lot of people that have that mindset about wanting to be the next Jeff Bezos, or wanting to be
get out of the EV business.
It's just go invent something, or go but for this, it's
except for Elon.
Well, and we haven't even talked about Tesla's business case, how it's vertically integrated. Tesla went off and did their own thing, and they consider the supercharger network marketing. They didn't
Right.
spend any money on advertising or marketing. They just plowed it all into infrastructure. And
yeah, and in fairness, they monetize the cars to make up for that, and that's absolutely a model. I mean, on one hand, I tend to be really averse to the idea of more walled gardens. I do not want
I know
Audi and Chevy and everybody to go out and build their own individual networks. But I think a lesson for some of the others is all of them should be investing in some form, and there's a variety of ways to do that. And you know, Ionity in Europe is one example where the CCS automakers all got together and said, we need a network and we're just going to get together and fund this thing. That's one. You know, buying subscriptions is another, and for now it's kind of a marketing expense, but ultimately you could mark up the car a little bit to help subsidize that. The psychology is what's important here, where the drivers like the free charging and they pay for it in some form always, even for Tesla. It's just less obvious. And that's part of what they need to play with more. But I mean, on one hand, Tesla has obviously been super successful with the supercharger network, and on the other hand, I don't want everybody else to build their own, because that's not helpful in the long run to have all these little different segmented things. You can go to Chevron, you can go to Texaco, you can go to Shell.
Well, but I mean, for the automakers that are not Tesla to consider that, you know, they need to have some type of a strategy to help sell that car.
They have to offer the service somehow.
At the very basic of just like providing a level 2 home charger with the car, or, you know, I think a lot of them are moving towards making the cord set either 120 or 240, but help to not only sell the car, but you also have to sell electricity as a fuel source. So having even education around that, you know, would be helpful.
That's a perfect segue, because next, we're going to invite into the treehouse Matt Teskey from ChargeWay to talk about electricity as a fuel.
Yeah, I've seen his presentation. Yeah,
yes,
he'll be a good one.
Very enthusiastic.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Well,
indeed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ran over a little bit. I'm sorry, but
nice to meet you, Russell.
Whenever you and I talk, it always is passionate.
I'm already waiting for
lunch to unpack this whole conversation too.
I know, right?
There we go. I'm already excited about your next visit.
Okay.
So,
well, thank you for having me.
Because I have notes. We're going to talk. Okay.
All right. Hey, looking forward to it. I'll be out there learning more. So next time I hopefully have something new to add.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, my friend.
If people want to contact you, they can get a hold of you at adoptacharger.com. I assume there's a contact or adoptacharger.org, excuse me.
Thank you. Yeah, you can connect through my website, adoptacharger.org, or my email address is kitty, Kitty, .adams, ADAMS, at adoptacharger.org. And I mean, it's not just the utilities I'm talking to. If there's some passionate EV drivers, reach out. I'll see what I can do to help you, you know?
For sure.
For sure.
Okay. I know. I love it. You help everybody.
See?
We're in it together.
That's how we make things work.
Exactly.
That's a beautiful thing. Well, thank you again, Kitty. Thank you, Chelsea. We're going to say goodbye for now. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you soon again in the treehouse.